Russia spent nearly 2 years trying to solve one of the war's biggest problems. It had to protect expensive warplanes from Ukraine's increasingly capable drones. And Putin had found a solution: thick concrete walls, reinforced roofs, and enclosed storage areas. All of this was going to protect multi-million-dollar warplanes from Ukraine's unmanned aerial vehicles. Russia scattered these hardened hangars across air bases, primarily in occupied Crimea, and pulled its valuable jets inside these concrete shells. But Ukraine proved once again that these shelters may no longer provide the protection Russia hoped for. Because in modern warfare, protecting a jet doesn't end with hiding it behind concrete. And Putin is learning this a little more painfully with every aircraft he loses. The freshest proof of this claim came in the first days of July 2026. And back to back at that. On July 1st, Ukraine's security service struck the Saki military airfield, targeting the hangars on top and several aircraft. But Ukraine didn't stop there. Only a few days later, on July 3rd, the SBU attacked the same base a second time, and this second blow was much heavier. According to Ukrainian sources, 7 hangars where aircraft were hidden were struck in this attack, and at least 7 Russian warplanes were destroyed or damaged. According to the claims, among the struck aircraft were Su-30SM and Su-30 multi-role fighters, some of Russia's most valuable platforms on the southern front, as well as Su-24 frontline bombers. In the same operation, another important base in Crimea, Vardisa Airfield, was also struck. Here too, hangars storing Shahed-type drones and aviation equipment were targeted. So Ukraine, by hitting the same area twice in a single week, showed this was not a coincidence but a systematic campaign. So why persistently Saki? Saki is positioned on Crimea's western coast next to the Novo-Fedoriva settlement and is one of Russia's most important naval aviation centers in the Black Sea. Su-24 and Su-30SM aircraft taking off from here support Russian missions over southern Ukraine. They drop guided bombs on frontline targets and provide air cover for naval operations in the Black Sea. So Saki is not just an aircraft park. It's one of the launch pads for attacks directly aimed at Ukraine. Striking it means targeting Russia's air power on the southern front, right where it's born. The same goes for Havarisa. This base, hosting both tactical aircraft and Shahed drones that strike Ukrainian cities, is another critical link in the attack chain. Targeting these bases also has a symbolic meaning because Saki was the scene of an entirely different event in August 2022. Massive explosions that shook the base had declared to the entire world that even Crimea, which Moscow considered untouchable until that day, was no longer safe. In the time since, Russia worked to fortify these bases against precisely such attacks. Concrete shelters were at the center of this effort. This is why the satellite images shared immediately after the latest attack were so striking. In the images, the massive protective doors of numerous hardened shelters were seen ripped off, and the roofs of some hangars were directly penetrated. The concrete Russia poured for years was now riddled with holes, and how this penetration was possible deserves understanding in its own right. Russia's logic was perfectly sound at the start. In the war's early period, Russian jets were parked either in the open or in thin metal hangars at most bases because Moscow had trusted the distance of its air bases from the front and the depth of its territory for decades. But Ukraine's increasingly extending range and accuracy rotted this assumption from the root. When long-range drones began striking bases in Crimea and even much deeper, aircraft in the open turned into stationary targets. At this point, Russia turned to a solution Western militaries have used for decades: hardened aircraft shelters, thick reinforced concrete walls, steel-reinforced roofs, and heavy blast doors. These structures would both stop fragmentation effects and prevent a single hit from destroying multiple aircraft. In theory, pulling a jet inside this shell made it nearly untouchable. But Ukraine found more than one way to crack this shell and made the problem much more complicated for Russia. The first issue is the munition itself. According to Ukrainian officials, new generation long-range drones can now carry much heavier warheads reaching up to 200 kilograms. This means enough energy to exceed a shelter's protective threshold. But what's truly critical is how this power is used. If a shelter's strongest point is its thick front wall and door, its weakest point is its roof. A drone diving from above at a steep angle can penetrate the roof by targeting precisely this thinnest point. Moreover, in such attacks, it's often not even necessary to completely destroy the shelter. In many hangars Ukraine struck, the protective blast doors may have been left open for maintenance or air circulation. A single hit entering through an open door renders all that concrete protection meaningless. And even in cases where penetration isn't needed, the damage can be lethal. A warhead exploding in an enclosed space creates a pressure wave that multiplies within that narrow area. An aircraft's most sensitive parts, its avionics, radar, fuel system, and weapons, are extremely vulnerable to this sudden pressure and heat. Even if the aircraft looks intact from outside, it may never fly again with internally collapsed avionics. Add to this the concrete's own betrayal. In a sufficiently violent explosion, even reinforced concrete scatters fragments breaking off from its inner surface, filling the enclosed area with high-velocity shrapnel. The structure designed to protect the aircraft when hit correctly turns into part of the danger. But there is a deeper truth being overlooked in this entire picture. Ukraine's real target may not even be destroying individual aircraft, because modern air power operates not just with aircraft that take off, but with an entire system that keeps those aircraft in the air. A warplane is an extremely demanding machine. For a jet to take off, its engines need to be checked, its avionics tested, its weapons loaded. All of this depends on mechanics, spare parts, ground support vehicles, fuel lines, and technicians working in a protected area. What we call air power is actually a constantly turning wheel. The jet takes fuel, gets armed, takes off, strikes its target, returns to base, and is refueled and rearmed by a tired crew to be prepared for the next mission. What Ukraine is actually attacking is this wheel itself, to stop it. Shooting down the jet in the air isn't necessary. Destroying a hangar, a maintenance workshop, a fuel depot, or ground equipment is enough to break that base's rhythm. In this logic, a jet that cannot take off today is just as useless to Russia as a jet that never existed. And slowing this wheel can directly reflect on the hot war at the front. Because these jets, taking off from bases like Saki and Hardiska, don't fly for nothing. They carry one of the front's most feared weapons to Ukrainian positions, guided aerial bombs. These weapons, actually ordinary free-falling heavy bombs, are transformed into precision munitions that can glide for dozens of kilometers by attaching wing and guidance kits to them. A Russian jet can launch these bombs from a safe distance without even approaching the front line, crushing Ukrainian trenches. This is exactly where the connection is made. If a burning hangar at Saki grounds several Russian jets for days, this could mean fewer bombs falling on a Ukrainian unit at the front. Of course, this is not a one-tune equation, but the logic is clear. As the number of Russian aircraft taking off drops, the fire landing on the front theoretically lightens. In a war of attrition, where progress is measured meter by meter, these small differences can accumulate over time and turn into a real outcome. Moreover, this is only the military side. There is also the economic face of the bill every lost aircraft cuts for Russia. And that bill is written with ruthless mathematics working in Ukraine's favor. Numbers reveal this imbalance nakedly. The cost of the long-range drones Ukraine uses generally ranges between $10,000 and $100,000 depending on model and payload. In contrast, the price of an Su-30SM multi-role fighter those drones target is approximately $35 to $50 million, depending on configuration. Along with a jet, a pilot trained over years of work is often also lost, and training a combat pilot is a process at least as long and expensive as the aircraft itself. Replacing the aircraft with a new one is a separate and much deeper problem for Russia because the production of jets, like the Su-30, is directly in the crosshairs of Western sanctions. The Yakovev company producing these aircraft and Su-30 manufacturing specifically was explicitly placed on sanctions lists. Yet these jets' insides from navigation hardware to flight control computers were dependent on components imported from Western firms for years. When sanctions closed this door, Russia began procuring parts through shadow supply networks established via countries like the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and China. These networks are still operating. According to one investigation, more than 4,000 part shipments reached Russia in nearly 3 years alone. But this is not a permanent solution. The parts coming through this route are most often uncertified, of uncertain lifespan, and increasingly expensive. Moreover, this uncertainty also increases safety risks. So can't Beijing fill this gap? It's filling it partly, but not entirely. China's aircraft parts exports to Russia have approximately quadrupled since the war, approaching the $1 billion annual mark. However, China has not yet been able to offer a reliable alternative to Western technology, especially in the most critical areas like engines and advanced avionics. According to experts, such a level of substitution reaching maturity will take the end of a decade at the earliest. The emerging picture is a patchy system keeping Russia's aircraft standing, but increasingly wearing with declining reliability. This imbalance is squeezing Russia between two bad options. The first is keeping jets at forward bases close to the front like Saki. This enables rapid response to combat missions, but it leaves aircraft right inside Ukraine's increasingly extending drone range. The second is pulling aircraft much further back to safe zones. This protects them, but imposes entirely different costs. Longer flights where engines and airframes increase the maintenance burden and reduce the number of sorties an aircraft can fly per day. Pilots spend their hours on the road before even reaching the front. Then there is the fuel dimension. Although precise data is limited, considering Ukraine's constant attacks on Russian refineries, flying aircraft from much further back over much longer distances may be adding additional burden to already strained fuel logistics. What Ukraine is doing in Crimea is exactly this. And this pressure is part of a planned campaign far beyond individual attacks. This campaign even has a name and a timetable. President Zelensky in late June launched a 40-day operation to escalate pressure on Moscow. This is not a random series of attacks. It's defined as a deliberate influence operation aiming to force Moscow toward ending the war. The operation's bulk consists of long-range strikes against high V-value targets. The Saki and Hardiska attacks in Crimea are only the most visible links of this much broader operation. The military logic behind this campaign also has a name: parallel operations. In the traditional approach, attacks are sequential. One target group is struck, the result is awaited, and only then does one move to the next. Parallel attacks load multiple points of the enemy system simultaneously. The aim is not to destroy a single target, but to shake the entire system at the same time. An airbase, the radar protecting it, the energy line feeding that radar, and the refinery the aircraft taking off from that base will strike. All are gears of the same war machine. When all of them are hit at once, the enemy has much less time to repair, shift resources, and say everything is under control. Ukraine is achieving this not with a massive air force, but with a much cheaper toolkit consisting of a combination of drones, missiles, sabotage, and special operations. The key reason this approach works at Crimea's air bases is the sequence of attacks. Before striking a base, Ukraine most often targets the air defense shield protecting that base. According to reports, in 2025 alone, hundreds of Russian air defense systems and radars were destroyed or damaged in visually verified form. Every radar blinded opens a new hole in the protective umbrella over Crimea. All this tactical success is actually covering a much deeper and structural wound for Russia. Russia's ability to compensate for lost aircraft is weak not only because of sanctions, but for a much more fundamental reason. Russian military aviation has fallen behind an entire generation. The place showing this most clearly is Russia's strategic bomber fleet. Most of the aircraft raining long-range missiles deep into Ukraine today, Tu-95 Bear and Tu-22 M3 Backfire, are products of the Cold War platforms whose designs date back half a century, becoming increasingly difficult and expensive to maintain. Russia has been trying for decades to renew this aging fleet. The new generation stealth bomber packet designed for this purpose is practically a ghost. The project has been struggling with delays for years. As of 2026, there is not a single independently verified prototype flight, and serial production estimates have already slipped to the 2030s. Moreover, the delay itself is structural. A modern stealth bomber depends on precisely the advanced materials, engines, and electronics that sanctions struck. What truly shows how dire this picture is a comparison. While Russia is still captive to half-century-old aircraft, the United States put the new generation stealth bomber B-21 Raider into serial production during the same period. So the gap between the two nuclear powers, far from closing, is steadily widening. The issue is not only about bombers. This is a symbol of a vicious cycle engulfing all of Russian military aviation, because producing a strategic warplane is one of the most challenging tasks for a military industry, and Russia is rapidly losing this capability. Every jet Ukraine strikes in Crimea touches precisely this open wound. Russia today cannot fill the places of the aircraft it loses, just as it is also losing the capacity to produce tomorrow's aircraft. This is why every loss in Crimea steals not just from today's, but from tomorrow's air power. This entire picture is impressive on Ukraine's behalf, but placing it in the right scale is also necessary. These attacks mean neither that Russia's air power in Crimea is finished, nor that concrete shelters are entirely useless. Above all, those shelters are still serving their function. The fact that concrete shells can be penetrated doesn't mean they're worthless. They still complete most attacks, require precision hits, and still defeat many threats directed at a base. Neutralizing a shelter is many times harder than striking an aircraft in the open. So, Russia's concrete investment didn't go to waste. It simply can no longer deliver the absolute security it promised. In addition, it's worth being cautious about the scale of reported damage. A significant portion of the claims is based on Ukrainian sources, and independent verification is limited. Although satellite images can show structural damage, they alone cannot prove which aircraft were inside those hangars or the full scale of the loss. Second, Russia is a power that can adapt to this situation. It can further strengthen shelters, reinforce the air defense protecting bases, and disperse aircraft to safer deployments. Ukraine is not going to wipe Russian air power from the map with a single campaign. Expecting this would be unrealistic. Moreover, it is also possible to read these attacks as a sign not of Ukraine's strength, but of its constraints. Because it cannot conduct a ground operation to actually recapture Crimea, Ukraine may be choosing to erode it from afar. But all these objections don't refute the essential point. They merely frame it. Because every adaptation step Russia takes also costs it a price. More concrete, more money, bases further from the front, and a slower tempo. Most importantly, what it's losing is a feeling confidence. If a shelter has become not absolute protection, but merely a trench that buys time, then every aircraft, every technician, and every pilot at that base no longer feels entirely safe. In war, this uncertainty is often as wearing as the physical damage itself. So, how much longer can Putin protect this fleet, whose replacements he cannot build in an increasingly narrowing sky? Share your thoughts in the comments. We will continue to follow these developments. Subscribe to the Geo Network.